Hello everyone, my name is Samantha Dow. I'm the site interpreter here at Grant Cottage. Welcome. We are in the midst of celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Coincidentally, 2013 is also the 150th anniversary of the Saratoga racetrack. It is well known that Ulysses S. Grant is one of the great military figures of the Civil War. What's barely known is that he was also one of the great horsemen of his era. It seems especially appropriate that during Travelers Week of 2013, we offer a porch chat that focuses on Grant the horseman. General Grant will be portrayed by cottage tour guide Steve Trimm. Imagine, if you will, that it is the summer of 1881. Ladies and gentlemen, Ulysses S. Grant.
First of all, let me say I'm delighted to be back in your part of New York State. My wife Julia and I have been here on several occasions. The very first time, I'm going to break character and I'm going to tell you that is not to signify a prisoner has escaped. That's the noon whistle. They always blow it at the prison at 12. So let's let that fade down and then I'll get back in character. Okay. My wife and I have been to this part of New York State several times. And we think it's one of the most beautiful places in the country. We first came here in 1865, in July, just 3 months after Appomattox. It was the first time in years Julia and I could be by ourselves without demands on my time. And we came to the races. Your track had opened just 2 years before. And though I'm not much of a gambler, I do love horses. And I love to be around people that appreciate horses. So Saratoga seemed, well, I was just drawn to it. And we came back. When Julia was First Lady and I was President, this was our first presidential vacation to Saratoga. But of course we've seen other sites in the area. We've been to Lake Luzerne and Lake George and Glens Falls. We've been to Round Lake, Saratoga Lake. And our final judgment is we're going to keep coming back. This is a truly lovely part of the world. As to today's topic, I don't know that I'll have enough time to tell you all the stories that are in my head about horses and horsemanship. But let me begin with this. The talk, I know, has been advertised under the name Like the Fabled Centaur. The entire quote from what that fragment is taken is this: the horse and rider held together like the fabled centaur. Now a centaur, as you know, is a creature from Greek mythology that is part human and part horse. But that particular statement was given by James Longstreet. You know him as a Confederate general, but James Longstreet and I were cadets at West Point together. Now his nickname was Pete, and I always think of him as Old Pete, so I'm going to lapse into that. Old Pete saw me, rightly or wrongly, as the best horseman at West Point. And this is the description he gave of me riding. The horse and rider held together like the fabled centaur, meaning the horse and I were in such harmony. We moved together so effortlessly, we appeared to be one being. Again, I don't know if that's true, but I've always appreciated that quote from my old friend. You know, they're putting up monuments on battlefields now to the heroes of the North and the South, and that is as it should be. But I look to the day, they're going to put up monuments to war horses and the humble mule, the humble army mule. Without the horse and the mule, we could not have won the war, and that is a fact. Just think about it. To maintain an army in the field, you must bring supplies of all kinds to that army, be it weapons, be it food, be it tents, and those items have to come in wagons pulled by horses and mules. We could not have maintained our armies in the field let alone won battles, without the horse and the army mule. And I hope someday there will be monuments to them. They deserve the recognition. I can't remember a time when I was not around horses. My father, Jesse, owned, I mentioned earlier, my son Jesse is named for my father. My father, Jesse, owned several tanneries and leather goods stores. And whenever customers came by, of course, they had to, we had hitching posts, basically, hitching rails for their horses. And I have no conscious memory of this, but my parents tell me that when I was a wee little toddler, I would run between the horses' legs, I would swing from their tails, and onlookers were horrified, but nothing ever happened. And someone talking to my mother, Hannah, said, well, it must be that Ulysses, he's a little boy, but it must be that he's one of these people that understands horses. My mother shook her head and said, no, horses understand Ulysses. Implying that they were slightly brighter than I was and knew I meant no harm. In which case, she might have been right. She might well have been right. My first real story about horses occurs when I'm 8 years old. I was already in love with the animals. I knew the sort of creatures that I wanted as my very own. And we had a neighbor named Mr. Ralston who had a colt for sale. And I badgered my father. I said, Father, you must buy this colt for me from Mr. Ralston. And Father said, I don't think so. He's asking $25, and I'm really not sure that the animal's worth that. But I kept pestering him. And perhaps you who have had children will recognize that if there's enough pestering, you might give in. In this case, my father met me halfway. He said, son, here's what I'll do. I will let you negotiate with Mr. Ralston. Here's what you do. I will give you the $25. You go to him, and here's what you do. You offer him $20. And if he says no, then you offer him $22.50. And if he says no to that, then you can pay him the full $25. And I was off like a shot. But I did not understand the concept of negotiation. I got to Mr. Ralston and I said, sir, my father says that I am to offer you $20, but if you say no, I'm to offer you $22.50. If you say no to that, I'm supposed to give you $25. And you know how that came out. There is an aside from that story that I've been thinking about lately. It's probably worth mentioning. The story itself is amusing, and it's worth telling on that account alone. But there was a kind of a, well, let me put it this way. I grew up in a little town in Ohio called Georgetown. I was 8 years old. All my friends were 8 years old, and when they heard this story, they began to mock me and tease me and make my life utterly miserable. And I was humiliated. And as I got older, there were other moments where I did something foolish and felt humiliated. And peers rubbed it in. And I began to think as I got older, one of the worst experiences in life is to be laughed at and to feel humiliated. And I honestly believe I carried that thinking on into the war years. You know, at Appomattox, as the Union troops were cheering our victory, I told them to stop. I said, the rebels are our prisoners, but they're also our fellow citizens again. Do not humiliate them. And I had said the same at Vicksburg, and I had said the same at Fort Donelson. I would not have the enemy humiliated. And I think this sensitivity to humiliation probably began when I tried to buy that horse from Mr. Ralston. And I have been egged on to write memoirs, the story of my life. And I am debating including that story if I choose to write the book. Well, I'll give it some more thought. But There's one of my stories from my early years. As a teenager, I was already, my father trusted me so much. He gave me a horse and a wagon, and we had what was, in effect, a wagon taxi from Georgetown to Cincinnati, a distance of 40 miles. And I conducted that taxi alone. My passengers were sometimes a little worried, but I never lost a one. No team ever ran away. I was able, at a very young age, to have such confidence around horses that I could travel 40 miles without any adult supervision and do just fine. By the time I was in my mid-teens, local people had recognized my ability with horses. And some of the local farmers began bringing their more high-spirited animals to me to break and to tame. And I did that. And I will give you my secret on how I did that. I would not inflict any pain on these high-spirited animals. I would not frighten them. It seemed to me that the reason horses are sometimes so seemingly wild is because they are frightened. They are terrified. They do not know what's going on when a human being sets down on their back. They are scared. So instead of using a whip, instead of using spurs, I stayed on the horse, firmly in control, but I would not hurt him. I would inflict no pain at all. And after a time, the animal understood that I would do him no harm. I was in control. I would do him no harm. And if he were to obey me, I would reward him with apples, sugar cubes, and the like. So in the end, my secret for taming wild horses was to treat them with kindness. And I'll tell you, I have always, this is almost embarrassing to admit, but I hardly ever lose my temper, except when I see cruelty to animals. This I know sounds odd for a man who has been in the midst of war, where great horrors were done to fellow human beings. But human beings at least have the capacity to defend themselves. Animals don't. And when I have lost my temper, it has usually been when I've seen cruelty to animals. In any case, that was my secret for taming wild horses. By age 15, I was taking 70-mile rides alone and doing just fine. Now, Georgetown, again a small town, was a stop on a circus route. And one year, the ringmaster offered a bet. He said, I have a wild and a ferocious horse no one has been able to ride. And I will bet any man or boy in this house $5 that he cannot stay on this animal's back for 2 minutes. Well, it was obvious that this horse had been trained to buck and to twist and to contort. He had been taught to throw every rider. But I thought the ringmaster was underestimating me. So I took the bet. And sure enough, the moment I was on the horse's back, he was up on hind legs, he was twisting, he was bucking, and I was staying in the saddle. And the ringmaster was getting very irritated. So after about a minute and a half had passed, the ringmaster went to a little cage at the edge of the tent and brought out a live monkey and threw him onto my back. So beneath me is a bucking horse, and on top of me is a monkey clawing at my face. And I stayed on that horse for the next 30 seconds, and I won that bet. Finally, West Point. I did not want to go. My father made me go. I was a terrible student. I had only one good subject, mathematics. But I think my friend, old Pete, was probably right. I was probably one of the better horsemen at West Point. And I say, I know it doesn't sound modest, but let me put it this way. On graduation day, my class, 1843, I was called out to do a demonstration. When horses jump a rail, the rails traditionally are perhaps 3 feet high. I was given a horse called York, who was a beautiful animal, very strong. I'd ridden him several times at the academy. And the challenge was this: instead of the rail being about 3 feet high, some very brave cadets stood there with a rail across their shoulders. And my challenge on graduation day was to ride York down the field and to leap that rail. And he and I did that. We accomplished that. And we set a record, which stood at West Point for 25 years. No cadet broke that record until 1868, just as I was entering the White House. And to further Pete's argument that I was the best horseman at West Point in my class, the Army recognized that I was the greatest horseman because they assigned me to the infantry. If any of you have been in the service, you know that's how they operate. They see a special talent and ability, and they make sure you never get a chance to exercise it. In any case, this is a delicate subject, but at heart I do have a romantic streak, so I must mention this. I know you younger folk can't imagine how important a horse and buggy might be when you were courting a young lady. You could visit her at home, of course, and sit in the living room with your sweetie and her parents. Or you could perhaps go out on the porch and sit in the porch swing and know that her parents were listening at the window. You never had any privacy when I was a young man, except when you went on buggy rides. Now, my first duty station after West Point was at a place called Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis. And one of my fellow classmates was from the area. His home was only 5-10 miles from Jefferson Barracks. And I went to visit him one day, and, well, I liked him a lot, but I liked his sister much more. Julia Dent, I was smitten from the moment I saw her, and I courted her intensely. And here was the moment I will always remember. Her favorite horses were named Fashion and Psyche. And we'd hooked them up for a carriage ride. And we'd done this dozens of times. It didn't seem like it was going to be a different day. But we came to this little creek called Gravwalk Creek, a bridge across the creek. The creek was in flood. The water was almost up to the bridge, and it was boiling. Clearly a very dangerous moment. I'm driving the buggy, Julia's next to me. Suddenly she slides over next to me, put her arms around me and says, "I will cling to you no matter what you say," implying she was scared to death of the creek. She had never done this before. So when we got to the end of the bridge, I stopped the buggy and I turned to her, and I was a very shy young man. I don't know how I put it into words, but I got it out. I said, "Julia, I want you to cling to me for the rest of your life." That was how I proposed to her. And I think the only reason I had the courage to do it was I knew the only witnesses were Fashion and Psyche, and if she said no, they wouldn't tell. But she said yes. So that, I know I've had military victories, but sincerely, the moment I treasure as my greatest victory was when Julia Dent said she would be my wife. And 2 horses were witnesses to that moment. The Mexican War came in the 1840s. And I won't tell you too much about that except one story involving one horse. I was a regimental quartermaster, meaning my job was to make sure supplies got to the regiment, wherever it was. And as the regimental quartermaster, I was excused from combat. I was not expected to be in battle. But at West Point, I was not sure I was cut out to be a real soldier. I had to find out. I had to find out. So on any given day, when it appeared that the American troops were about to charge the Mexicans, I found a way to be at the front lines. And when a superior officer questioned me about it later, I said, well, lacking the moral courage to go back to camp where I had been ordered to go, I had to charge with the regiment. So, I was in the middle of the Battle of Monterrey. And the situation was this. The Mexicans were on one side of the street, the Americans on the other, and the Americans were running out of ammunition. And the only way to get word back that we needed to be resupplied was to ride down the middle of that street. There was no other way. They asked for volunteers, and I volunteered. They gave me a horse. I don't know the horse's name. They gave me the horse. And I rode him out into the middle of the street, and I just... You've seen paintings, perhaps, of the Plains Indians attacking wagon trains, and they are hanging on their horses' necks, using the horse's body as a shield. That is how I rode down the middle of that street in Monterey. And I made it. And I was able to get my regiment resupplied. I wish I knew that horse's name. There are all kinds of, how can I say this? Horses, like people, come in a great variety of personalities. They have obvious strengths and weaknesses. Some horses are just not cut out to be war horses. They are too high-strung, they are too easily frightened, much like some human beings. But this horse, utterly fearless, just a gauntlet of fire. And it did not panic, it followed my instructions. I wish I knew that horse's name. But that is my one story of horsemanship from the Mexican War. As an aside, during the Mexican War, the Army was testing different types of saddles. And there was a new saddle by a fellow out of St. Louis named Thornton Grimsley. I told you Jefferson Barracks was near St. Louis. I actually knew Mr. Grimsley, and he was a saddle maker. He was what Michelangelo was to sculpture. Mr. Grimsley was to saddles. He was just remarkable. And I'll have a little something to say about the Grimsley saddle in a minute. But first, let me continue with the military part of the story. When the Civil War came, as you may know, I was not in the Army. I left the Army years before. I'd been a farmer for a time, that didn't work. And when the war began, I was working in my father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. I sent telegrams to the War Department asking to be reinstated in the regular Army. Heard nothing. So I turned to the state government. There were state regiments being recruited. And I was given command of the 21st Illinois. Our first mission was to Missouri. Missouri was a border state. It could go either way, Union or Confederate. Many Confederate forces in Missouri. As my regiment is marching through Illinois, the horse I had been given, it was obvious he would not do. So, stopping at a farm en route to Missouri, I just purchased a horse that I thought might have possibilities. Purchased him from the farmer. The horse's name was Jack. He was cream-colored. He had this beautiful silver tail, black eyes, and he was very intelligent. Jack was a wonderful horse. And I want to tell you just one story about Jack. This happened in Missouri. Our objective was a Confederate camp at a place called Belmont. Belmont was very close to the Mississippi River. And just upriver was Cairo, Illinois, where the Union was assembling its gunboat fleet, which eventually would command the Mississippi River. Cairo was very vulnerable. The Confederate troops at Belmont were organizing for an attack. Our mission was to break up their camp, destroy their supplies, make it impossible for them to take the offensive. So, my troops came down the river on a series of steamboats. We offloaded on the Missouri shore, and we surprised them. We sent the rebels running. They rallied, surrounded us. We cut our way out. they began to melt away. We burned their supplies, we burned their tents, we destroyed their capacity to take the offense. I thought, mission has been accomplished. I told my troops to go back to the river and reboard the steamboats. The troops are en route, and I am the last man on the field, and it suddenly occurs to me, I have been really dumb. I have not set up a rear guard. I do not know if the rebels are right on our heels. So I turned Jack around, and I rode back towards what had been the battlefield. To do that, I was actually going through a cornfield, and the corn was literally, it was so high that even on horseback, you could not see over the top. All I could see was straight ahead down this little narrow road, and the only daylight I could see was at the far end. So I'm riding cautiously down this corn row, and out in the sunlight I suddenly see rebel soldiers. And thank God they are not coming down the corn row. They are moving from left to right. They are only 50 yards away. And I think, not much for praying, but Lord, don't let them look down this corn row and see me. I very carefully turned Jack around. We began to walk down the corn row, and when we were far enough along, I went into a gallop, and we just tore the rest of the way to the Mississippi shore. Now, if you know that part of the Mississippi River, you know that there's only a very tiny beach. What you have on the western shore are embankments that are almost perpendicular, not quite, but almost, 15, 20 feet high. So Jack and I are suddenly looking 20 feet down, and the last steamboat has just left. The captain saw us standing there, backed up the boat, and threw out a gangplank. Gangplank was perhaps that wide. Jack did not hesitate. He put his front feet together, his forefeet. He brought his hind feet up, and he slid down that embankment. Didn't throw me. I managed to keep my seat. And now he's faced this gangplank, which is perhaps a foot wide. And Jack didn't hesitate at all. Up that gangplank he trotted, and we were safe on the steamship, and we got back all right. Jack was a fabulous animal. He was a true war horse, and he became very famous. They reached a point where everybody in the North wanted to see Jack. So I donated him to what was called the Sanitary Commission. This was an organization of civilians that took care of our Union wounded. They bought medical supplies, medical tents, they hired doctors, they sent nurses to the battlefields. The Sanitary Commission kept many of our fighting men alive. And to raise money for them, I gave them Jack to raffle off. Jack was eventually raffled off for $4,000. I know it's 1881 now, and 1881 dollars are not worth the same as 1862 dollars, but I assure you $4,000 was a fortune back then, and Jack deserved it. He absolutely deserved it. All right, Belmont was in November of '61. Shiloh, April '62. Two stories from Shiloh. The rebels caught us by surprise. Surprise attack worked on the morning of April 6th. They broke through us. They pushed us back to the Tennessee River. We were hanging on by our fingertips. Dusk was falling, and some other officers and myself rode out to our left to examine the situation. Now, I thought I knew where the rebels were, but I wasn't sure. Nobody was sure. But it was dusk, and I thought, I can just see the terrain. If any rebels are around, we're virtually invisible. Well, that turned out not to be the case. These officers and I were on the edge of a meadow when suddenly the trees on the far side of the meadow erupted in gunfire. I was wearing a sword. A bullet hit the sword and shattered it. The officer next to me, his hat was blown off his head. The third officer, his horse was hit. But we ran. We got out of there very quickly. The horse, sad to say, died. But I wondered, how on earth did they see us in these conditions? And then I realized they could see Jack. Jack was cream-colored. He had this beautiful silvery tail. And even in this murky light, they could see him. And that decided something for me. There was always a debate in those early days about the types of horses officers should ride. One theory said, for your men to see you in battle, you must have a horse that is easily visible, which makes sense. But on the other hand, if your men can see your horse, the enemy can see you as well. You become a better target. And from that point forward, the horses that I used during the war were all solid color. They blended in with the background. It was a conscious decision on my part. I hated to part with with Jack. He was a sweetheart of a horse, but as I said, he wound up giving the Sanitary Commission $4,000, and it was worth it. On the morning after the Battle of Shiloh, some of my troops found on the battlefield a horse that had been abandoned by the rebels. And this horse was raw-boned and ugly. And they took this horse and they presented him to one of my aides, Colonel Legau. And they thought this was a great joke because Colonel Legau was a very fastidious gentleman. In the heat of battle, he looked like he was dressed to go to a cotillion. He was a handsome and dashing man with not a stitch of clothing ever out of place, and they thought giving this man a really ugly horse would be very, very funny. Colonel Legau did not think it was that funny. I was going to have the horse shot, and I said, a moment. And I examined him. I thought, this horse has been abused, and he does look like he's at death's door, but I think I'm seeing a thoroughbred here. If we can feed him and bring him back to health, he might actually turn into a war horse. And indeed, that is what happened. After he had been rested and fed, he turned into one of the great war horses of the Union Army. I rode him at Vicksburg. But he was still ugly as sin, so I named him Kangaroo because that's what he looked like. Kangaroo was my first mount at Vicksburg. However, let me put it this way. I have never been a fashion plate. Julia has always complained that I don't know how to dress. Now, I had some help today. But even when I was president, let's put it this way. The photographs you see of me as president, I have been dressed by my wife for those. I was really very shabby, I'll be honest with you. I didn't care. And it was doubly true during the war years. I did not care how I looked. But my orderlies, they made sure. But you see, I didn't wear an officer's uniform. I wore a private's uniform. The only way you could tell my rank was by the stars on my shoulder. And my orderlies wanted to make sure the enlisted men knew who I was. And if I wasn't going to dress like a general, my orderlies were going to dress my horses like generals. So my horses were always very well dressed, and Kangaroo never looked better than after my orderlies had dressed him for whatever the occasion was. But here's a secret. You see these monuments of great soldiers on great steeds, and they are poised with swords, and nothing is going to stop them on the road to victory. The truth is, anybody who rode a horse for any length of time always had a sore rear end. Every horse has a different personality, every rider does. Every horse has a different gait, the way he moves, depending upon the rider's build. The motion of a horse and rider can be very smooth or very jerky and will not flow at all. And as much as I love kangaroo, perhaps he jumped like a kangaroo, I don't know. I developed what we called in those days a carbuncle in a very private place. They're kind of like blisters. They can become infected. I know I am supposed to be a war hero, but I have to tell you, after several weeks at Vicksburg, my rear end hurt really badly, and I needed a new